Have I ever told you guys that I think that native Linux gaming is a little bit of a meme? Now, that doesn't mean that I don't like gaming on Linux. Most of my gaming is done on my Linux system, with a little bit done on console, but for the most part, it's done on this system. Whenever I'm playing something on PC, it's going to be on Linux. And I stream twice a week over my gaming channel, link to that one in the description down below. But when it comes to games made natively for Linux, I honestly think it's a big waste of effort, and while I appreciate the sentiment of the no tux, no bucks guys, I really can't find myself supporting it. And recently I felt a little bit extra justified when I tried to play some Dead Cells on stream. So I was playing the native version of Dead Cells. Up until that point, it was working perfectly fine. No problems whatsoever. I didn't update, and then one of the libraries I needed was just missing, and it just wouldn't work. I restarted Steam, reinstalled the game, it was just missing. Now, there was probably going to be some way I could actually address that, but then I went and launched up the game inside of Proton, and it just worked. Now, Dead Cells is a game that is still being heavily updated by the developers, so you don't really get the second problem, which is if, say, a game is, let's say, 10 years old, hasn't been updated in ages, at some point, that game is going to stop working, because at some point, the dependencies you've installed on your system will be incompatible with the dependencies required for that game. It happens with regular software, it happens with games, it happens with everything on a Linux system. All software that is not being updated anymore will eventually break if what it needs actually is still changing. Now, I want to be very clear that gaming on Linux and Linux native gaming are absolutely not the same concept and should be kept as separate ideas. Gaming on Linux is just not what it once was. You don't need Linux native binaries to actually play a game perfectly fine on Linux. Things like Wine are absolutely amazing now, and most things just work with a bit of tinkering, and we have things like Lutris to make that tinkering just a little bit easier. And if you play games through Steam using Proton, a lot of the time you just don't have to do anything and it just magically runs. Now, obviously there are exceptions, but in a lot of cases these exceptions are completely arbitrary, especially in the case of multiplayer games where the anti-cheat just doesn't know how to handle a Linux user. I want to make one more distinction. When it comes to doing Linux native development, I don't want to discourage that. If you want to actually do that and you actually want to do it properly, please go and do so. That would be absolutely amazing. But when it comes to the people that say, oh, just no tux, no bucks, that shows that no one has any interest in that game actually coming to Linux. If you're running that game through Proton, the developers actually see there are people trying to run the game through Proton, and if there are enough people, maybe they'll decide to make a future game available for Linux, or maybe they'll release a Linux binary for that one. Just not buying the game isn't very helpful. Considering how light of a game Dead Cells is, it runs about as well through Linux native as well as through Proton. But this isn't the case for every single game, but in a lot of cases, the Proton version actually runs better than the native binary. And that's not just with the small selection of games that I own. If you go onto ProtonDB and look up basically any Linux native title, in the section that actually shows what people have done to get the game running, most people are going to say, just run it through Proton. With the exception of a couple of titles, most of them just say, run Proton, it'll run better. Now you might be thinking, if the game is a Linux native title, shouldn't it be running better than running through a translation layer? And yes, it absolutely should be if the software was well designed. But this is one of the problems. Most game developers aren't developing for Linux, they're developing for Windows and then releasing binaries for different operating systems. And it's the exact same thing with general software as well. So GIMP is one really obvious example. GIMP is mainly made with Linux in mind, but there is also a Windows binary. And if you've ever run GIMP on Windows, you would know it is horribly slow. And that's because it's just not what the main development platform actually is, and it wasn't properly optimized for that operating system. But from a business perspective, this just makes perfect sense. So if your biggest market is Windows, and then macOS is not a close second, but it is a second, and then finally at the end, you have Linux. What are you going to be mainly developing for? macOS barely gets support, and Linux is going to be even less important to focus on. It just makes sense to make your game for what's going to have the most users actually playing it. Forget the whole thing about how Linux users apparently don't want to pay for anything, which is obviously nonsense going by the fact that most projects are funded by donations. The single biggest reason why most games that come out on Linux are an absolute mess is because of market share. If Linux, or let's say if macOS was the biggest operating system, you would see games work perfectly on that operating system, and then on everything else, well, if they get released, they get released. At the end of the day, under a perfect scenario, basically every game on Steam should run perfectly fine under Proton on Linux. The reason why a lot of things don't is the same reason why a lot of games have trouble just running generally on Windows as well, and that is due to heavy anti-cheat and heavy DRM. Up until a couple of years ago, anti-cheat could be completely avoided if you just played single-player games, but because there's a lot of games now that have microtransactions built into them, well, some single-player games now actually have anti-cheat, which baffles my mind. Ignoring the weird AAA studios that do things like that, multiplayer games need some form of anti-cheat. There's just no way to get around it. If you don't have anti-cheat, well, your game turns into an absolute mess on the first day. But anti-cheat can be handled in a sensible way. So let's take, for example, Counter-Strike, which obviously does have a Linux binary, but its anti-cheat works perfectly fine with Linux clients. Or let's take, say, Denuvo anti-cheat, which doesn't actually run if you're running a game under Linux, but it doesn't go and automatically ban you or automatically block you. It flags you as a Linux user and then gives the developers the option to decide what they want to do with that person. Now, DRM, on the other hand, straight up does not need to exist because it does not achieve the goal it's supposed to be achieving. So generally, DRM is there to protect your first week sales, the sales that are going to be the majority of the sales you actually make. But most games have a crack on the first day it comes out. So anyone who wasn't going to pay for it will download that version. Anyone who was going to pay for it will download the version with the DRM. It didn't stop anything. And then in the case of bad DRM, it may produce, say, performance issues or graphical artifacting, so the people who pirated the game are getting a better experience than the people who actually paid for it, which doesn't make any sense. And ultimately, that doesn't just hurt the Linux players, it also hurts the Windows people as well. But hey, on the bright side, the DRM could be worse. It could be tied into very important internal libraries for the application, and then if the DRM isn't functioning, the application doesn't launch. But in a lot of cases, DRM seems to basically just be slapped on at the end, and when you're using a DRM package, well, people already know how to crack it and just crack it straight away. The way that I handle games I want to play is I don't dual boot to play any of the games I want to play. If it won't work on Linux, I just won't play it. There are other games to play. I'm not dependent on that one game. I want to encourage developers who make games that run fine on Linux, that don't use awful DRM and don't use awful anti-cheat, and even if they don't want to release a native binary because they just don't feel like it's worth the effort, if the game runs fine in Proton, I want to support this developer. And I feel like this approach just sort of benefits everyone. And it's also one of the many reasons why I mainly play indie games, because unlike a massive AAA studio, they don't really have billions of dollars to protect. They just want you to play their game, so there's no reason for them to actually have horrible DRM there. Play the game. So if you're a developer and your idea of porting a game to Linux is just hitting the export to Linux button inside of Unity, just don't bother. Just release the game on Windows and let people play it through Proton. If you're not going to put the effort into actually optimizing the game for Linux, just don't bother. Maybe you think I'm completely wrong, and I'm sure there's at least one person who absolutely does, but this is how I feel about Linux gaming, and if you think I'm wrong, let me know in the comment section down below. So that's going to be basically everything for me. And before I go, I would like to thank my supporters. So a special thank you to Joachim, Donald, Logan, Michael, Andre, Nathan, David, Carl, Mitchell, Will, Brennan, Shikabento, Jamie, Joseph, Josh, Peter D, Stephen, Tees, through Tony Tushar, and all of my $2 supporters. If you'd like to go and support work, the links down below to my Patreon, subscribe star, leave a pay, all that sort of stuff. I've got my podcast, Tech Over Tea, available basically anywhere. And then this channel is available over on Odyssey. I've also got a gaming channel called Brodie Robertson Plays, where I play games on this Linux system, doing live streams twice a week. That'll be everything for me, and I'm out.